one of the challenges with any input is farmers to figure out how will it work for my farm.
Coming up, we're talking crop inputs with Ariel Patton. The Modern Acre podcast is presented by Myland, a soil health company that's revolutionizing agriculture. Through their innovative soil as a service, Myland partners with farmers to improve their soil health with the power of beneficial live native microalgae. The result? Healthier soils, more productive farms, and benefits like smarter water use. Discover how Myland can transform your farm at myland.ag. Guys, we are back with Ariel. She writes the newsletter Topsoil, which is a newsletter all about frameworks for agriculture at just the right depth. So we get Ariel on about once a month to debrief her newsletter. This month, it was about crop inputs. We dig into what are crop inputs, what do they mean? What are the implications for agriculture? And we talk about some areas of opportunity in the space. So I love doing these episodes. It's always fun to catch up with Ariel. She's going to have a new edition out all about biologicals soon, so you don't want to miss that. Obviously, we just launched AgList, the Yelp for biologicals, so I'm excited to get her take on the space. Be sure to subscribe to her newsletter and hope you guys enjoy this conversation all about crop inputs.
Hey, Ariel, welcome back to the show.
Hi, great to see you guys again.
We're back, another Topsoil edition. This one talking about inputs. Just a great conversation for us nerds to talk about this topic in agriculture. So maybe give us a lay of the land, I guess that's a good pun, Ariel, about crop inputs and kind of the overview.
Yeah, so for this edition of Topsoil, I really cover agricultural inputs. And so typically that's referring to seeds, crop protection, fertilizer. These are and I really focus on this one on kind of those purchased inputs farmers use every year. And so we talked last time about how budgets are really tight and farmers are tightening the belt, cutting out any unnecessary expenses. And so when you look at that farm budget, farmers are still spending anywhere between 25 and 40% of their budget on ag inputs. So we know they're really important. And at the same time, I think there's a lot of different reasons why this is an area that we're trying to, the industry is trying to innovate on. There's a lot of downstream effects, but they're solving real problems. And so my goal with this edition was really just to understand the basics so that people can understand the status quo. What do these products do for farmers? Why do they use them? And what each of these different things are.
Excited to get into it and just talk about kind of this channel in general. I think probably one of the more sticky relationships in agriculture of like everyone talks about kind of the trusted advisor, this whole relationship. And like for our farm, like it's relationships that we've had for decades of like the local nutrient branch and the other local input provider that we deal with. And it's very hard to kind of get in the middle of that. And there's kind of this piece with PCAs and writing recommendations if you're in California and specialty crop that makes it even more kind of entrenched. And if there are products available that aren't with our current retailers, it's kind of hard to plug and play and like add in kind of a net new party. So we can kind of jump in there. But I guess let's start kind of on the seed side, maybe just talk to us about that part of the space.
Yeah. So, and I think kind of taking a step back on where all these products come from. So there's typically manufacturers, and that's a pretty consolidated part of the business. I mean, I had done some analysis earlier that between 2 and 3 companies make up over half of the volume sold on all of these different pieces, whether it's seed, crop protection, or fertilizer. And so oftentimes those manufacturers will sell to a distributor, which then distributes to retailers who then sell to the farmer. And Tim, that's exactly what you're talking about, of like your local retailer that you interface with. And some of these manufacturers do sell directly to farmers. So seeing that with the seed, this is where of all the different inputs, seed, especially for like corn and soybean farmers in the Midwest, seed has the most loyalty among seed, crop protection, fertilizer. When Purdue surveyed a group of farmers, I think 60% said that they were loyal to their seed brand, whether that's Pioneer or DeKalb or others. Only 36 and 33% of farmers were loyal to their crop protection and fertility brands. So I think a really interesting question is like, why is that? Why do farmers have loyalty to their seed brand? And, when we looked at yield, we saw that 70% of the yield gains over the past 40, 50 years are from seed. So I think the seeds really pack a lot of punch, and it really sets the tone for a lot of what other choices you can make with other input purchases. Over 90% of corn or soybean acres are planted with genetically engineered seed that can tolerate different herbicides, and so that seed choice really is a critical decision. And so a lot of times it's perceived as one of the most important decisions.
What a great insight! Like that's fascinating. Like the loyalty piece, I would have never. I don't know if I would have guessed that, but that is that's super fascinating. I think, like to Tim's point around just the relationship dynamics, I think that as opposed to like ag tech, this is what farmers have been historically used to. And it's like so close to the crop and the results of the crop, like you are the seed, obviously, and then getting into crop protection, like it's how the crop is growing, how it's performing. It's like right there, smack dab in front of you, and you're not going to risk. I think that's one of the reasons adoption of biologicals or ag tech have been harder, because growers are just trying to mitigate risk and make sure they don't lose their business that year. And so if they have that established trust of, hey, maybe we're spending too much on inputs, but like this is an area where we can't risk. So I think there's just this interesting dynamic happening with inputs in general.
Totally. And I think there's you talk about that dynamic, and there's a really interesting tension I see where these inputs do solve very real problems for farmers. And at the same time, I just saw this survey of Iowa farmers where 60% said, sometimes I feel overly dependent on purchased inputs. So there's both this tension of these are solving real problems. They're destroying pests that would otherwise harm my crop. I'm getting really great yield, but I do feel overly dependent. And so I think that's why we're starting to see exploration in new management practices, a lot more interest in regenerative, biologicals, and just some of these, and ag tech, other digital precision technologies, that kind of thing. Like, I think there's an appetite for it because, yes, these are real problems. These products solve a lot of these problems, but potentially there's other alternatives as well.
Yeah, I feel like there's been comments made about farmers in general have outsourced a lot of kind of the decision making off the farm to these retailers, and they've kind of built up this trusted advisor nomenclature of like, this is who you trust. And it is a double-edged sword where it's farmers have finite time. We've talked about the different hats that farmers wear of like, you can't be the agronomist, the controller, the tractor driver, the irrigator, all these different things. And so like as farms have scaled, like they've needed to outsource, and retail being no different. And so it is kind of a weird predicament that farmers are placed in where they've outsourced a lot of this out of necessity, but also now they're kind of dependent on these platforms as well.
Yeah. And side note, I think that, I don't know if we talked about this before, but the trusted advisor, that is a phrase that is everywhere. And it always cracks me up because I think, like, would you ever have an advisor you don't trust? It's kind of like, oh, I have an honest accountant or, a competent dentist. It's just kind of a funny catchphrase. That always makes me laugh.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I may offend some people here, but I think that maybe there's something to that from a marketing perspective of like, we're going to market this advisor as trusted, and because we're just going to lean into that, and we always have your back. But at the end of the day, we got to look where the money's flowing, right? I mean, we've talked about with all the Doge stuff, the government stuff, like where is the money flowing? And that will provide some insight on incentives, right? And this is, I think, the challenge in this model. We've talked about it on the podcast before. When you're as an advisor, you are incentivized to sell more inputs because that's making the company more money. And, we see this is a challenge even in the biological space that we're really passionate about, right? It's still the same thing, even though biologicals are more like regen focused and let's try to dial things back and shift things, right? There's still that incentive there to sell more, right? Of X gallons per acre versus Y, right? This is where I think ag tech could be a really big opportunity in just testing and data where growers can have more, be equipped more to just like, instead of just trusting advisor, Bill, you actually could have some data and some tools to equip you of. And I know there's a lot of companies looking at this type of thing, right? Is like, we know exactly how much to apply for these reasons. And I think that will continue. I think I see that area growing in adoption and interest and value for those reasons.
Yeah. And I think there's a broader, like the industry rallying cry right now of more with less. I do think that there's a lot of pressure on the input companies to have higher performance and that kind of thing for, use less product, get the same performance or better. And I do think that precision ag is another way that this is also being addressed, of just applying products when and where they're actually going to be valuable and be useful. And so it is nice to see that there's improvements in that area of how these things can be applied more effectively. Tim, I'm curious on Nest Farms, how you think about making these decisions when you're recommended all of these different products. How do you think about, evaluating that performance?
Yeah, like starting on the seed front, like a lot of the deals that we work are our buyers are actually facilitating the order of seed where they have 20 outside growers, and it's more effective for them to kind of buy that seed in bulk to get more advantageous pricing. And like we're typically like more thinking about like traits versus like the actual seed, or like loyalty to brand is like, I want this specific variety. And there's kind of, 3 varieties that all have different names that are manufactured by different seed companies. And so like, as long as we're kind of getting the traits that we're looking for, that's kind of what we're most interested in. If it's, yield potential, or if it's heat stress resistance, since we've been having hotter and hotter summers, like that's kind of what we're interested in, like discussing kind of at the seed level as we get those seeds sent to greenhouses for transplanting. On the fertility side, it's kind of a crop by crop conversation on kind of what the approach is for that season, working with, the trusted advisor, wink, wink, about kind of the optimal plan for that year, kind of like what our goals are, what the crop was in last season, what kind of the baseline nutrient profile of the soil is, to kind of come up with a field by field approach to fertility. We've gone a lot more into injecting fertilizer through transplant water and through the drip versus kind of like broadcast before the season, just being more precise with how we're applying that fertility, just right in the seed trench or transplant trench, and then going through drip to kind of be hyper efficient there. And then the crop protection is really like situational. Like we have kind of the placeholder budget, but like some seasons we just have high weed pressure, high pest pressure, and there's no kind of rhyme or reason to it. Just kind of the seasonal dictate kind of what the need is there. We've been kind of making an approach to kind of automate on the weeding side of, can we use finger weeders or be more strategic with hand weeding to limit kind of a downstream application of an herbicide later in the season. So just being kind of on top of that from a timeliness standpoint.
Yeah. And I imagine, because you're working with crops that are directly feeding humans, I imagine not only do you have to follow the label, which is, very federally regulated, but also I imagine there's other things that you're thinking about with crop protection on pre-harvest intervals and different things. Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Totally. Yeah. Like once you get closer to harvest for stuff that's going fresh market, or for all of our stuff, yeah, there's kind of restrictions on when that material can be applied before harvest. So always keeping an eye on that. There's even considerations for like if there's bees in the area, of like getting bees moved in and out for certain applications. So beyond just the label, there's a lot of different things going into effect on kind of, if we want to apply, how we're going to apply, what the approach is for these different materials.
Yeah, I think one of the things that it's not like a shampoo label of lather, rinse, repeat. It's really, there's a lot of very specific rules around how you can handle and use any of these products that I think always not surprises me, but is always a good thing to remember, just thinking about how all these different products come together, how they're used, how farmers have to keep all of these different things top of mind when they're, making all these different decisions throughout the season.
Always checking the wind. Yeah, just like all these things, you thought the weather was just the temperature. There's all these other variables of what the wind is. If you can't apply material, like what the ground conditions are. If you want to go in with a 4-wheeler and do a ground application versus aerial, there's a lot of moving parts.
Talking about this just gets me amped up because I'm just like, man, there's so much opportunity here, right? For startups, ag tech companies to innovate around this space because of some of these obvious challenges and how the market is structured. Tim, I think it'd be helpful for you to talk about your experience. You worked for a ag tech startup focused on crop inputs. So maybe you kind of talk us through that experience, what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah, so the company I worked for was called Harvestport. This was kind of late 2019, 2020 kind of time frame, but the idea business model was a group purchasing organization for crop inputs. Like this business model is pretty common in other industries in healthcare. Like a lot of big hospitals are all buying similar materials. They're all buying syringes and medicine and basically like bundling that need together to bid it out to get more advantageous pricing. So that was the approach with ag inputs, specifically in California with permanent crop growers. You have a lot of big growers. They're all buying seed rootstock. They're all buying crop protection, fertility products. Building that supply and bidding it out to retail was met with a few challenges. I think a lot of farms kind of operate independently. When they get to a big enough scale, they have an in-house person that's managing kind of their procurement. And so anytime you kind of introduce this new concept, it's like, is my job being replaced? And there was some sensitivity there. And then just with the way the business model works in California, needing a PCA to write a recommendation for certain materials, it was kind of clunky to do that at scale and not just be at a farm by farm basis. So I was met with a lot of headwinds. I think, operationally, regulatory within California, that framework of a PCA, and I think a lot of pushback from traditional ag retail. I think kind of more mom and pop retailers saw it as an opportunity to kind of get in front of new growers, but kind of the incumbents, I think, were a little bit opposed to them getting bid down more on pricing.
And one of the things that came up during writing this, it's pretty amazing how the way that a lot of these inputs are sold. I mean, again, these are massive quantities of very bulky goods that have to be ready at a very specific time. Like there's a ton of operational complexity, as you mentioned, Tim. A lot of innovation is really hard in that space to not only manage all just like the physicality of it, but then when you're thinking about cash flows and the financing piece, there's a lot of constraints, and even things like buying things online, right? Like I think Amazon just overtook Walmart as the largest retailer now. We don't really see that to near the extent in ag inputs. I think the most recent survey I saw was 10% of ag inputs are sold through, via online. And that's, a really small percentage. But I think that, as you mentioned, Tim, it's hard to innovate in this area where there's certain just physical and financial constraints there.
That's a super good point. Yeah, something I'm glad we brought up is just kind of the infrastructure piece. When we're ordering product from our retailers, like they provide ball tanks and totes and bubbles to move product around on farm, these bulk bins. Like if we found that product cheaper from somewhere else, like we'd have to go order our own tanks, and that's expensive infrastructure that a farm would be out of pocket to do if they wanted to kind of quote unquote buy direct. So that's a huge piece. Kind of there's a huge kind of head start these companies have, just kind of their presence on farm, where it's multiple times a week, where the ag retailer's truck is hitting farm versus a startup that's trying to get adoption, try to get boots on the ground that might be there once a month at best. So there's just kind of the on-farm presence, which is a huge advantage. And I think just a value add for growers, like if we're doing a new spray and we don't have the spray rig, like the retailer will drop it off. We use it for that application. They pick it back up. We don't have to own that equipment, manage, maintain it. So there's a huge kind of value add that these retailers are providing.
Totally. And I know we haven't talked a lot about fertilizer, but just thinking about, for corn, at least, nitrogen is really key. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK. And so just the ability to store nitrogen, massive volumes of it, move it around, be able to apply it. Many times it's injected into the ground, like all that equipment, all that infrastructure. That's a huge value add for farms to be able to use that infrastructure and to not have to kind of own all of that themselves. On the fertilizer point too, I think that's an area where I've seen a few companies starting to innovate around even just how the nitrogen is made, which I think is really interesting. Like the Haber-Bosch process is how most of it's made, natural gas and air. I learned from writing this that it's actually a pre-World War I technology. And now there's actually some new companies that are starting to have on-farm nitrogen manufacturing, which is really interesting to see. And so that's one that I'll definitely be curious to see how that plays out.
I'm glad you brought that up because the juices are flowing. Each of these different categories, there's opportunities and there's like exciting ag tech companies trying to address different areas, right? So it's just, there's so much opportunity in this space. I think the fertilizer one, on-farm production, we talked to Green Lightning on the podcast. There's another one, Nitricity, that are working on these things. And it'll be exciting to follow that and see how the technology evolves there to get to more of a commercial scale. I also wanted to bring up, we talked about the incentive structure with this trusted advisor piece. You also have another challenge, which is not only are those trusted advisors incentivized for selling more of something, they're also incentivized to sell their thing versus a alternative that exists, right? They're going to be selling their menu, right? And that's totally fair and valid for them to do so. The challenge that creates for a farmer, though, especially when experimenting with things like biologicals that aren't part of that retailer's portfolio, is how do you integrate these things? This is a challenge we've faced on our farm. We've explored a lot of biological trials on our farm, and there's just this weird dynamic where you have to talk to your retailer of, hey, we're going to try this on this field, and that means we're going to buy less of your product, right? And it just creates this tension there. But I think that's another just challenge within this space. And I think companies are approaching this differently. We talk about it almost like, I feel like every ad tech company we talk to is like, how are you going to market? How are you reaching farmers? Are you going through the channel or are you going direct, right? And we've seen like some that are very trying to work with the channel, work with the retailers. Harvestport, Tim's example was, I think, I don't know if you guys planted a flag on that way. And maybe that was one of the reasons why that was a challenge, right? That business was a challenge, is because you maybe need to pick a strategy. Whereas FBN, we haven't brought them up yet. They kind of went to market as like, we are the disruptor. Like, we are going to break this ecosystem by making everything completely transparent, and specifically in terms of pricing. That was the initial vision. And it's been interesting to see how FBN has evolved, and now they're doing their own products, right? So the same dynamic exists now, even with this startup that was going to be this disruptor and kind of be this independent voice. They did the same thing of, white labeling, where it's like Amazon and Amazon Basics, right? They become a retailer themselves. So I think, yeah, it's what gets me excited about something like AgList, right? Is like, we're not selling products, right? And it can be more of a truly independent platform. And I don't think AgList is going to solve all of these problems. It's not trying to, but I think there's an opportunity for more companies and startups to think about it in this way.
Definitely, Tyler. I think that one of the challenges with any input is farmers to figure out, how will it work for my farm? And I think that's a mixture of talking to other growers in their area, talking to their trusted advisors, looking at the research that's been done, but even conducting that research has a whole host of difficulties and costs and challenges to do that. So it's great that there's more information.
Totally. All right. Well, fun conversation as always, talking about agricultural inputs. We are super excited about your next edition, where you're just going to go deep on biologicals. Good luck, because that's a messy space to dig into. But thanks for jumping on, Ariel.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, Tim. See you later.
All right. Hope you guys enjoyed that conversation with Ariel. Subscribe to her newsletter. Be sure you're subscribed. Check out AgList if you haven't already, the Yelp for biologicals. And Tim and I will be at World Agritech next week on Tuesday and Wednesday. So we hope to see you guys out there.